Hello there guys, and welcome back to the channel. With everything happening around in the world in the recent days, I was having quite a bit of time to think to myself about where I want my YouTube channel to go and what do I want to do with it. And then I realized the initial reason why I made it was largely to showcase some cool interactions, cool gameplay, and also try and help out as many people and try and hopefully educate as many people as I possibly can about the things that I have some pre-existing knowledge in this game and give my opinions on them, and possibly help out some of the people who do not. So in order to get back to that base idea on my channel, we're going to be starting kind of a bit more educational series. And one of the bigger things that in game I feel that it is extremely unclear to a large number of players is passive buffs versus active buffs. What is the difference, how you can tell the difference, how they look different visually, and which one's better and what means what. So we're going to start with the first point, which is going to be a fairly simple one. How can you differentiate between when the buff is passive and when the buff is active? So in order to do that, I'm going to quickly jump into my pre-saved photos, and I'm going to give you a quick example here. So Colossus starts a fight with 3 active buff armor ups, and Winter Soldier in this case already has gained a Fury because he has kicked my teeth in. But you can see that that Fury buff, who does not have an line, kind of like a thick line around it, that is the difference. That is a passive buff, and that is how you can tell the difference. All active buffs will have kind of like a bright white line around them, and passive buffs do not. So there you can tell them visually different. We're going to have a few more examples of these passive versus active effects. Stun debuff I'm going to showcase, and a couple other things in the video. But the main thing how to tell them apart is that border on the outer edges of the buff itself. We can see that Winter Soldier's Fury, even though expiring, still has that white border around it. My region at this point does not. Here I think we can tell it a bit better at this point. Here is a bit more region on a point, and it doesn't have an outer white border. That is how you figure out which buff is passive, which one is active. Whenever you do not see this border, the buff is in fact passive one. So now jumping back in the game, and what does passive buff mean and which one is better? Well, the right answer there is it pretty much depends on the circumstances. Passive buffs aren't inherently any better or worse than active buffs. They are different. And they are different in the sense that they interact with the game and everything else that happens around them. The base idea of passive buffs in general is the fact that they are not affected by outside circumstances, conditions, nodes. For instance, passive stun will not trigger masochism. Passive fury will not trigger buffet node. At the same time, passive effects typically do not get benefits from synergies and masteries, so that is a downside to them. So there are ups and downs. So we're going to showcase a very kind of like bright example here in the video right now, and I have pre-selected a team, and I'm going to be using Dr. Doom because that's going to be a very kind of like good way how to showcase the difference between those two buffs and where passive is better, where it isn't. So we're going to start with parry, but there is a limber active in Labyrinth of Legends, as we all know. And limber basically means that every time I stun, my stun duration is decreased. You can see that the stun is going to be expiring quicker and quicker and quicker, up until it's going to be barely noticeable after a while. And nodes like limber quite often render masteries like parry useless eventually in the fight, because you only have a couple of them and then you cannot use them afterwards, right? So that would be a negative for this stun being an active stun, because it gets affected by limber and you continuously shorten the stun duration. So that is definitely like bad thing for it to happen. But at the same time, we're just going to bait out a heavy attack. We're going to see that it was a bit too slow. Bait out a heavy attack, we can see that the passive stun still has a full 2-second duration, because that is one of the Doom's abilities. Whenever he charges his heavy attack, he can consume a shock debuff, and by doing that, he inflicts 2-second passive stun, I believe. And we can see that the passive stun duration is always consistent. It's not affected by limber. It doesn't care about anything else in the game. It just works as it's intended. Now, the fact that it doesn't get affected by outer source also means it cannot get extended by masteries such as Stupefy, which is bad because typically you want to extend the duration of your stuns. So in this case, you cannot do that. However, on the flip side, nodes like Limber have no effect on your passive stun. Neither is nodes like Masochism. For instance, opponents with Masochism active would not be able to shrug off your passive stun. Also, debuff immune champions typically can always get affected by passive debuffs. So there's another innate advantage. So I'm not going to finish the fight, but hopefully that kind of like made clear the whole idea that active effects do get benefits and penalties depending on what nodes and what outer effects are taking place. Passive stuns typically do not get affected. Now, the game is progressing and we are having more and more passive effects added in the game, so that is changing as well, because there are certain specific abilities and or synergies that do affect passive abilities. The first one that definitely comes to mind, for instance, would be one of the She-Hulk synergies, where she has a synergy that specifically states plus 20% potency for personal passive fury effects. The simple as that. That is a specific synergy, specific outside source that does affect passive effects. But at the flip side, even though those are personal fury effects of hers that can get affected by this one specific synergy, they would not, for instance, be able to get a bonus from extended fury or enhanced fury masteries or anything like that of the sort. On the upside, once again, these passive furies will not trigger nodes like Buffet. They are not affected by fisticuffs, so on and so forth. So once again, being passive effect or an active effect inherently does not mean that it is better or worse. It means that they function differently, and passive effects largely are designed to function like isolated units that typically will remain unaffected and will proc, and there's going to be very little that stands in the way of them. But at the same time, there are certain things they cannot do and cannot benefit from. That would quite often be masteries, quite often be different nodes or abilities that would extend, for instance, buffs. Cosmic Champions have many synergies that extend all of their buffs. They do not extend the passive buffs. So that is the major difference. Now, you could also ask, what's the point and why do they exist? Well, first and foremost, my personal found opinion is that they are effectively helping Kabam to differentiate the game and release champions with more wild and interesting character mechanics without worrying of some unforeseen interactions. Now, we have seen, for instance, in Dorky Diggly Dave's video where I think Kabam Luke was explaining that at this point there are so many champions, so many different nodes in the game, and nobody can potentially expect and see and foresee all of the interactions that will take place in game. And when something gets missed, then pretty much something like cheese tactic comes to play, where something can often be abused. Now, making more passive effects in champions help Kabam to prevent that happening, because they control the interactions these passive effects can have much better, because they don't have to worry about any different masteries that's going to extend buff duration for some insanely powerful buff on a Cosmic Champion. They do not have to worry about some masteries on bleeds or stun effects, what will extend your stun debuff so you can infinitely keep stunning your opponents, so on and so forth. So they are much easier to control because they do not interact with, I would say, 90-95% of the nodes and abilities in the game. Obviously, on the downside for us as players, whenever we are forced to deal with passive effects, we typically have far less answers to those options. As a great example of that would be champions who shrug off debuffs. That's great, and we often use those abilities in order to combat damage over time effects. Two perfect examples would be Aegon and Ghost. Both of these champions are currently at top of the metagame because they can pierce through anything. It doesn't matter opponents and freezer burn, opponent trying to poison you, it doesn't matter opponents trying to put cold snap on you. Nothing matters, because these champions can effectively shrug off those debuffs, or in Ghost's case even benefit from them, gain even more attack and completely destroy these fights. Now, Ghost and Aegon neither have any actual immunities. They just have the ability to convert debuffs, active debuffs, into the Furies or shrug them off. Now, when they're facing a node like EMP modification, for instance, they do not get to shrug them off, and they do have to suffer through them. And that is an easy way for Kabam to control where these champions are and are not viable and how they can be used. So having more passive effects in game, and we can definitely see increase of the passive stuff coming in the game currently, does help Kabam control the metagame much more, and they can control interactions and avoid broken cheese tactics in the game. But once again, as a player, we have downside because it is much more difficult to combat these passive effects quite frequently, because much of our metagame typically centered not necessarily around having a flat-out immunity to something, but ways to play around it, like Ghost, like A-Gun. And when you're facing EMP modification, fact of the matter is that there are very, very few champions that are actually immune to shock. Our most typical way how to deal with shock debuffs is to shrug them off with A-Gun, with Ghost, or take no damage from them with Corvus. Corvus takes no damage from shock debuffs, but he still takes damage from passive shock effects. So we can say that 3 of our 5 most popular champions in the game cannot function properly against the EMP modification, at least not fully or as well as they would work. And when we look at kind of like more popular rank ups, for instance, I can't say that my account is fairly well ranked up, and I have most or many of the popular champions choices up here. Shock immunity is something that's still extremely rare, and when we look Nick Fury, shock immune no, can shrug off debuffs, cannot shrug off passives, and so he cannot deal with it. Corvus cannot deal with EMP modification or passive shock. Now Dr. Doom is one recent champion that is in fact shock immune, and that is a great plus for him because he can deal with that. Warlock, no shock immunity. I don't know, Blade does not get rid of passive effects any quicker. His abilities work on debuffs only. Medusa, Sabertooth, Night Rusher, so on and so forth. Pretty much none of our popular champions have abilities to deal with passive effects because they hardly exist outside of Gladiator Hulk. And there are champions, for instance, what I mean to say is there are very few champions that are, for instance, shock immune. Incinerate immunity and shock immunity is definitely coming into play more and more recently, but it's relatively new compared to Bleed and Poison. Therefore, majority of our ranked up rosters will not be able to deal with passive shocks and passive incinerates. Anyways, so that is kind of the conclusion on the passive effects. I realize I did get on off subject a bit too much at the end, but the base idea is you need to remember 2 things. In order to recognize which effects are passive and which are not, you just need to look at the debuffs or buffs themselves and notice the white border on the outside. If it is there, it's an active debuff or buff. If it's not, it's a passive one. And the main difference between a passive and active debuff or buff is the fact that they live as separate independent units which are largely unaffected by any and all outside sources unless specifically stated, and there aren't too many of them currently available in the game. Like She-Hulk Synergies, for instance, affects passive buffs specifically, but none of our masteries, none of our synergies otherwise would do that. And that is pretty much all you need to know about passive and active effects. And if I missed out something, please do let me know in the comment section below. Other than that, I hope I have helped at least a couple of you to gain a bit better understanding and ability to differentiate between active and passive debuffs and buffs. That all being said, I'll catch you guys soon, I guess. Don't forget to hit that like button and sub button. See ya!